No more updates. No, usually when I have to go on, then they'll be go. It's only when you're in an emergency situation when you have to get on. No sense like you need an update. It's Lisa. All right, we're up. Doing it's being okay. Let's record this for posterity.
Didn't know it was.
It's gonna be recorded.
Okay. All right.
All right, we got it. We're on. This is great. Hey, everybody, it's Wednesday. And that, my friend Doug, means it's Whiskey Wednesday. In case you were wondering. Whiskey Wednesday. Yeah. And we well, it's should I just call you Dickel Doug?
100%.
Okay. Dickel Doug is here. Doug Craigle is here with us today. I'll even say your real name. How's that?
That's fine.
He's also, for those of you who don't know, he's also good friends with Wild Bill Codman. So they all know Wild Bill.
Don't hold that against me.
It's being held against you right now. All right. Well, today we, hence your name, Dickel Doug.
That's right.
We're going to be doing George Dickel. We're going to be doing Tennessee whiskey. So, I'm going to let you take it away. I think, we should start. I didn't go over this before, but I think we should start is, what is Tennessee whiskey?
That's a great question, right?
Thank you.
That's great. That's a great place to start, honestly, for a lot of reasons. And one of which is that, the Cascade Hollow Distilling Company, where Dickel's coming from, right, and has been for over 150 years, right, has been making Tennessee whiskey for that long, right? And the thing that we have been doing, and I've been working with Dickel for 12 years, which is why they call me Dickel Doug.
Amongst other things.
Amongst other things. But they, spend a lot of time trying to get out there and explain this category when it's really as simple as the fact that it's a regional identity of bourbon. Hands down, right? So all of the regulations to make a bourbon are also the regulations to make a Tennessee whiskey, right? In fact, the federal government only defines it as a straight bourbon made in the state of Tennessee. And that's not even in our Code of Federal Regulations, right? The CFR doesn't say it.
Right.
It's our free trade agreement that says it.
Okay.
And so understanding that all of the scrutiny that goes into bourbon, right? The corn mash, right? 51% corn, new oak barrels, the distillation proof of no higher than 160, the barrel entry proof of no higher than 125, all and new oak every single time, right? This is all the same. There's two things that change, and it's from a state perspective. One, it's real easy. Appellation, right? The government's very clear about not lying on a label. So therefore, if we put Tennessee on the bottle, it's got to be from the state of Tennessee. The other one is that Lincoln County process, right? So charcoal filtration is that one step of filtering it through Maplewood charcoal, is that other defining characteristics. And it's the state deciding that. And what I find so fascinating about it is the fact that it wasn't until 2014 that the state enacted. It was Tennessee House Bill 1084.
Right. Almost over 100 years later.
100 years later. Yeah, exactly. Right. So there was no definition. This is all just, we talk all the time in this category. What is regulation and what is tradition? That's been tradition with Tennessee whiskey. In fact, there were only 3 that were allowed to make Tennessee whiskey and put it on the label coming out of the state before 2014 when this changed. And that's why we're honestly playing catch up in the category, because there were only 3 of them, right? And we were one of them. So that's the biggest thing to understand. Now, from this category, I think what's more important is understanding what does it mean to the people drinking it? What is our expectation of flavor? And that's what, it's great for the whiskeys we have today, because that's what we're really focusing on, is looking at this bottle and understanding what is our expectation by what it says on the front of it versus Tennessee whiskey versus a bourbon versus a rye whiskey.
And the other thing is, all the time when people argue, they the Lincoln County process, you can neither, for bourbon, you can neither add nor subtract flavor or anything like that. And they said, well, is it adding flavor or is it subtracting flavor? And it's like, no, it's just different. And the one that always gets me, and I just almost had this exact argument the other day, is you can tell me what you want, but I know Tennessee whiskey tastes different than bourbon. And I go, guess what? Every bourbon tastes different from every other bourbon also. So if you just like a certain characteristic of a distillery, doesn't necessarily define the characteristic of an entire category.
100%. And I mean, let's think about it.
I'm going to get hate mail now, but that's okay. I'm used to it.
I like it because honestly, let's think about bourbon for a second, just as far as the fact that it's been dominated by one state for so long. And yet even bourbons coming from anywhere else in the country are going to taste different, let alone distillery to distillery.
Right.
So now location is a part of it too, just like Tennessee whiskey. That's actually one of the reasons why the first whiskey we have today is there. And Nicole Austin, who's the general manager and distiller at Cascade Hollow, she spent a lot of time and care with these products, which everything that we have here is a part of her regime, if we'll call it that, since she's been there at the distillery very specifically. And part of this first whiskey is in order to stop that argument. Because if we think about charcoal filtration for a second, it is a completely neutral separation step. And I've heard Nicole say it a bunch of times, and she's much smarter than I am. It is in the same chapter of the chemical engineering handbook as distillation. It's either separation due to relative volatility or separation due to a chemical affinity for charcoal. So either way, if we take the whole whiskey making process and we divide it into two buckets, which is flavor creation, flavor separation, it's part of the separation step, just like distillation. It's just an extension of it, which honestly, I would make the argument that Tennessee whiskeys are typically bigger and bolder than bourbons. Although some people might say, well, I love bourbon. You take bourbon, then you filter it, so it's just lesser bourbon. But in fact, like at Dickel, off of our column still, we don't make any cuts. There are no heads, hearts, and tails cuts, right? So everything coming off of that column, we're using it all because we have another thing coming. And so I'd argue then for bourbon distillers to get it right, to get into the barrel with the right liquid so that it can develop the way they want it to, you might have to be a little bit more specific, right, about those cuts so that you don't have anything that goes askew once your hands are off of it. And so we have another moment in order to do that. So we can allow for a larger range of flavor, I'd say, off of the still to then be refined differently before it goes into the barrel.
Now you're saying it's part of the distillation process, but we could even talk about the filtration process because that is the only filtration process that you have. Correct?
Well, yeah, we do have. So post dump, we have a small, but it's just
rough.
Pretty standard rough.
Get out the big pieces.
Exactly.
Okay, and then so and then the other difference with Dickel and let's say the other very famous Tennessee whiskey would be the way you guys use the Lincoln County process because it's a little bit different where you're flooding the chamber.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is explain exactly what happens in the Dickel Lincoln County process.
100%. So as far as the filtration goes, it is a full immersion filtration, right? So we've got 10 feet of charcoal, Tennessee sugar maple charcoal. We source that sugar maple from like central Tennessee. We open air burn it. And then our leachers are 13 feet tall. And we get 10 feet of charcoal that's going to pack that in. But if you can imagine, right, essentially you've got this amount of charcoal here. We've got a plate on the bottom and sheep's wool blanket. Then we've got 10 feet of charcoal, another blanket, and a perforated plate.
You actually heard that. It's a sheep's wool blanket.
Yeah.
So, and you actually heard that. Randall has actually worn one of the blankets, but we won't get into that because it almost got kicked out of the distillery. But anyways, you're basically setting up cartridges.
Right. And so when we flood that blanket that sits on top, although the bottom one's really another filter,
right,
the one on top is also there for surface area pressure. So essentially, if you flood the tank, as new liquid comes in, it's going to saturate the blanket first and allow for even pressure as opposed to an oscillation, right? If I'm pouring into a pitcher or a cup that's got ice and water in it and I add more to it, what happens? It penetrates down and it mixes it up as it happens, as opposed to evenly pushing it through. So the full immersion filtration allows for that equal. So we know every bit of that whiskey is spending the same amount of residency time with each bit of carbon that's in that filtration.
It also stops like, because if you look at it, take your ice analogy too. If you have like almost like, a loose block of ice and you start pouring in, it actually, water creates its own path.
Right.
So then you have all these little pathways that it's creating in there. And so is it really getting filtered by the charcoal? Maybe not, but if you flood it, all of it's got to go through.
Right. So because carbon is that, it's the great natural filter that it is, because it's so porous on a macro and a micro level that your surface area is maximized, right? There's so much surface area for it to do its job. But the second you have an empty vessel that has no liquid and just has carbon in it, think of it also like snow. You guys are pretty familiar with that, right?
No. Usually in the spring, but we are familiar with it.
But so if you watch icicles slowly drip off your gutter into the mound right in front, down below it, what happens is you get this pathway. You get this hole in that one spot. So eventually it's going to find the path of least resistance and it's going to travel that way. So unless you manually then move everything around in the charcoal, which is usually what folks will do if they're doing that method, it's going to eventually erode down certain pathways. So it could become less effective over time. You could have to change it more often, or have to go in and manually oscillate them and move them around. So we're able to put it in, lock it up, and let it sit for what is usually about a 3-month period of time, all by sensory. That's the number one question we get asked at the distillery when we're in that room is, okay, how long does it sit with, how long do you use that charcoal before you're done with it? And that's all about volume, right? So we want it to have the same amount of time there, but it's the faster we feed in, the faster it comes out, and then we have to rotate. So, but it's all sensory. We're going to pull samples off the bottom,
right?
Nose it, taste it, understand if it's still doing what we want it to before we change it.
And what do you think? What's the feeling? What is it doing?
The
So when because when you're taking it out, you're doing a sensory, right?
Right.
What are you looking for when it comes out of the filter?
So one of the things that I found, and I've been lucky enough to taste pre and post charcoal distillate, right? And when you compare those two, one of the things that it's really pulling out more than anything else is there's a lot of maybe because we're such a high corn content, 84% corn, I see a big shift in some of the green notes that are coming off of the grain on the distillate, where you're removing some of that. It's less of those green notes that are coming in, and we're getting a creamier, rounder, and a bit sweeter distillate afterwards.
Okay. Well, before they mutiny on us, we probably should drink something.
Yeah, probably.
All right. So number one is
the George Dickel bourbon.
George Dickel bourbon whiskey, aged 8 years.
Yep.
So this we sort of don't say Tennessee whiskey. Does not. So we're taking out the Lincoln County process.
We are not.
Okay.
So
because legally you don't have to.
That's besides the fact that this is,
what's the ABV?
The barrels were telling Nicole to make this whiskey, which is really what it comes down to. The one thing she did when she got there, right? This is when we get to this is the first project that anyone saw in the world that was released under her regime there, right? This was the first thing she started working on, the Dickel bourbon, because the first thing she did when she came in was like, okay, we have all this inventory in our warehouses. She asked for a full inventory, mature stock inventory review, which our 5-person warehouse crew was not that happy about, because they're going in, they're pulling new samples of lots across all of the inventory for her to create what is already her system of evaluation of flavor, right? As opposed to the one that was there before. And in doing that, she kept kind of coming across the same situation, which was that she was writing down the same notes, which was for her shorthand was CB, or classic bourbon. So she's like, all right, as this all ends up, she's like, I know what the Dickel signature, formerly known as the Dickel number 12,
right,
and the Dickel classic, formerly Dickel number 8. I know what those taste like,
right?
And they don't taste like bourbon to me. And everybody out in the world also says it doesn't taste like bourbon. So what are we doing with all of these barrels that are manifesting with this classic bourbon flavor profile? And so that's when she decided to change the narrative at the distillery and say, instead of asking or saying, what have we always done in the past? It was, what's the best use of the barrels we have? And this was born, right? It also, though, allows her to kind of quietly, not so subtly, kind of stop the arguments that people were having on the internet and things of like, if it goes to the Lincoln County process, it's violating the no additive law for bourbon, so it can't be so. And she's like, okay, well, the government wouldn't let us do it and approve this label with bourbon on it unless that was true. So it's kind of like a big whiskey bottle shaped exclamation point in the end of the argument. It's kind of like a big whiskey bottle. I guess we should try it, right?
Yeah, why not?
Let's do it.
We're here to drink whiskey. It's Whiskey Wednesday. That makes sense.
I guess we should try it, right?
Yeah, why not?
So
We're here to drink whiskey.
one of the things, hopefully, that you all can kind of find as well when we're tasting this together is that one of the things, hopefully, that you all can. You wanted to hit the center of the dartboard of the expectation of flavor. So it's like, what do you all think when you see this? And let's be honest, there's a lot of people out there that don't know Dickel as a brand, even if it's been around for 150 years. Yeah. Right. So
Yes.
that is what we wanted to deliver on, was this idea that you see this bottle, you don't actually know what Dickel is as a brand, but you see gold label, old timey font. It says bourbon whiskey, aged 8 years, 90 proof. I think I know what that's going to taste like, right? And so we already come into it with a preconceived notion of what it is. And that's exactly what we wanted to deliver on. That's what Nicole wanted to deliver on, because it wasn't our place, right? We've been making Tennessee whiskey for 150 years.
Right.
It wasn't our place to make a bourbon that's, 2 steps to the right of bourbon. That's for the bourbon distillers that have been making bourbon for 150 years. And we've all accepted, and they've established with all of us that they make great bourbon. Now they're going to make something else and be like, hey, we made our bourbon and then we did this thing to it because we thought you'd like it. Right. That's for them. For us, it's like we're already stepping us to the side because we're making a bourbon when we normally make Tennessee whiskey. So we needed to really just establish first that we can make a bourbon that's going to hit your expectations.
Great nose on it. I love the nose. Great nose.
Yeah, I mean, it checks.
So you're hitting, you're getting all of those flavors. You're getting so you hit brown sugar, you're getting caramel, you're getting wood notes. The one thing I would say on this one, on the finish, is I'm also getting a big like cherry finish on this. Cherry.
Yeah, from cherry, some people see it almost to like
cherry finish.
Maybe the kind of apricot and things like that that pop into the bourbon world a little bit.
Fruit.
Stone fruits, yeah, things like that. There's the fruity side of it, which fruit manifests pretty easily and traditionally in Dickel. I think we get a lot of big fruity whiskeys, especially in like our single barrels and stuff like that. But balancing in and honing in that on the specific fruits that we all kind of associate with bourbon is really what we want to deliver on.
What do you guys think? Pretty good, right? What do you guys think? Not bad.
Yes.
Pretty good, right? Not bad.
Yes.
Pretty good, right? Not bad. She was defining what she wanted the classic bourbon to be.
Exactly. For us, right? And hit that expectation of hopefully what you would consider classic bourbon to be. When Nicole worked on these the blends to finalize this, one of the things that she very specifically did was to work on and set up each of those final blends that she was kind of debating over for this whiskey, was to set up a double blind competitive set for herself, right? So other bourbons within a similar price point and age range, in order not to try to beat any of them, but to really just make sure that they actually fit in. She's
grouping.
like, I did.
She's looking for grouping.
Exactly. She's looking for this idea. She's like, I've done a good job, I think, if I can't necessarily tell. If it sits with the same expectation of these other bourbons, then I've done what I've set out to do. And that was really that final.
Because better is subjective.
Right.
What she's trying to do is be objective.
Exactly.
Right.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah,
Right.
it really is exactly it. And that's why, and I mean, I'll be honest with everybody here. That's not like we're recording it or anything, but
no one's listening to us.
No one's listening. I mean, like I said, I've worked for Dickel for 12 years, and having conversations about Tennessee whiskey. And when I heard we were making a bourbon, I was kind of like, okay, all right. It's, one of those things where I had to take back and be like, okay, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? I need to know. I tasted it and I was like, oh, thank God. I was like, this hits everything. This is exactly what I could hope for from our facility put into a bottle that says bourbon on the front of it.
Amazing. I think it's solid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's, I
You
mean,
get some Converse tonight, I think, too, on this.
okay. I like that. Yeah. I mean, honestly, I'm drinking the Kool-Aid, obviously, but to me, if any of y'all were to come over to my house, this would be that thing where it's like, I'm like, what are you having? You're like, I'll have a bourbon. And I don't know you well enough to know what you drink this type of bourbon, this, and that range of whatever your preferences are. I know that I could grab this and be like, I got one for you, and pour it for you, and you would be perfectly content. Right. That to me is a good house bourbon, right? That I don't have to go one direction or another. I know I'm going to hit right in the center of it, and we're going to have a good time.
I mean, you're shooting for a price point that's below 40, sub 40, right? With this, and it, as an 8-year-old, I mean, that's competitive.
Yep,
at
100%.
that at 90 proof.
Well, and I mean, that was, she did draw the line in the sand. Like she said, I wanted to very specifically put an age statement on, which is not traditionally something that we've done besides single barrels in the past, is putting an age statement on the whiskey. And she wanted to do that in order to kind of showcase that value for this whiskey.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What do you guys think? Good.
Right.
All right.
All right.
Yeah.
Perfect.
What's that? Can you have some more? Well, we poured Kavork size tastings for you tonight, so we're only doing this one. So tastings for you tonight. All right, good, solid. Yeah, let's go. Let's go. Because this is one of my favorite categories. The fact that we're doing a bottled in bond because of the out of the stipulations. And this was fall. What did I put? Fall 2008.
Yep.
This all comes from fall 2008. It's got to at least be 4 years old.
Right.
Right.
And it's this fall 2008. This is our 4th release of this bottled and bond. Right. The first one came out, and that was the fall 05, 13-year-old. That's the one that won Whiskey of the Year, which is really all of the stuff that we've been able to do. Like Nicole being able to convince anyone in the company to be able to put out a bourbon, be like, hey, listen, no, we're gonna go hard left here. I don't think like this is what set the stage, to say, okay, we trust you. The first release comes out and does that. This is our second fall 2008, so the second time she's visited this specific distilling season. The first one was an 11-year-old, which I still see out there occasionally. It was in Kentucky, but I found one just yesterday. So being able to revisit that distilling season also kind of showcases this concept that, there's enough good whiskeys that can really be within 6 months of time. That's what bottled and bond is, I think. It's that single distilling season, one distillery, and 4 years old and 100 proofs, like all those things. To me, it's rooted in transparency. That's why I'm sure it's why it's your favorite category. I mean, it's like my favorite subcategory, but it's the most highly regulated subcategory in American spirits.
Well, it's one of those type of things. If you want to, if you want to start comparing products, it's where you can start. Yep. It's actually you're more likely to be comparing apples to apples if you're in the bottled and bond arena.
I talk a lot, like as far as like what a lot of tastings where I think about this idea of proxies for quality that we have, and whether or not they are valid or invalid. And sometimes it's like you may have the folks that are calling for high proof whiskey as a category. It's like, well, that's a hard one, to be like, what's the highest proof whiskey you got? Because, I want you to melt my face off. Like, that's the only thing you're
getting. That's a prerequisite, right? Melt my face off.
Yeah.
Well, the other part of that too is I am seeing more and more. I don't know. These guys may tell you better, but I'm seeing more and more people going. A lot of people want cast strength, but I'm also seeing a lot of more people going like, well, it's too hot for me. I don't want cast strength. I want below that. Why isn't anybody doing below that? And then we talk about thinking of things like that are cast strength like that as whiskey concentrate. And you can certainly add water to it. You can add water to it. Distillery added water. If they want to bring it down, they've added water to it. And, at the end of the day, for myself even included, a lot of my cast strength stuff, I am probably usually drinking between 100 and 110.
Yeah.
I don't have anything very specific to tell you, but I know when I start hitting that with some water, I know that's where I'm ending up.
Yep.
And so one of those type of things, people like, well, I don't want to do a cast strength. Well, at least do 100 proof.
Yeah.
Even if it's not bottled in bond, you should be like somewhere in there, because I think that's ultimately that's where a lot of people are drinking, because when you start getting up to 120, 130, 135, 140, you're anesthetizing your mouth. You're losing flavor.
Yeah.
Because not by any other means, but like that's how you numb your, they used to wanted to pull a tooth. They give you a lot of whiskey until you were sort of drunk, and then they pull the tooth because it's anesthetizing your senses. So
I mean,
100
honestly,
proof to me is also a nice way to judge how somebody's doing. You can't. There's no way to hide.
yeah.
You start getting it. There's no way to hide. It's right there.
Well, and I mean, anything under 100, I think it's the distillery is telling us where we should be drinking it at, right? Like that's them already saying, all right, here we are. The dilution idea, I always think for me, high proof whiskeys, anything over 110 is just an opportunity for me to create my own experience. Of course, I'm also the kind of whiskey nerd that's going to like order a high proof whiskey and then, wonder if there's going to be a slower dilution rate with a 2-inch ice cube instead of a 1.5-inch sphere as I put it in there. And like, what's my first sip to my last sip going to be? And I've done those experiments before just for fun. But
I used to do those too, but then I always misjudged and I just kept doing them. And then I forget the whole experiment by the end of the night.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I stopped doing that because I found I never got to the end. It's like, getting to the end of the Tootsie Pop. I just never made it.
Well, and so, I mean, at the end of the day, I think bottled and bond in that proxy idea is that this is for any distillery when they're releasing a bottled and bond whiskey, what they're doing to me, at least, and what I think when I see it on the shelf is like, this is them saying, here's who we are at our center, our core, right? Everything's stripped away. It's transparency, and it's from one snapshot, right, of the distillery. Here's who we are, right? And if you look at this one, I mean, it's still, although it's a little faded out from the bottled and bond part of it, it still says Tennessee whiskey on it for this one in particular, right? So coming at us now, as it should shift slightly out of, it's close to, but shifts slightly out of the bourbon realm a little bit into what our Tennessee whiskeys manifest to, but still giving this,
Well, how old is this? How old is this one? Did we say
13?
It's 13?
Yeah. Yeah, this one's 13. The previous fall 2008 was 11. So we came back to it 2 years later.
Those on it's really great. This is great.
So we came back to it 2 years later. Yeah.
Those are like caramel. Great.
Came back to it 2 years later. Yeah.
Those are like caramel. Great. Are you going for the higher number, or are you just using up stock at this point?
So
that's the question.
The number is not the goal for Nicole, for sure, because we've gone down to 11, and so the target is never
profile more.
Yeah, it's never an age. Well, it's profile, but it's that combination. Like any bottled and bond is, there's so much more. Like from a business perspective at a distillery, there's so much more to it because you may find a great handful of barrels that are in this distilling season, but do you have enough to actually have a viable product that's going to ship out? And that's the other part of it. So she's never going for an age range. It just happens that a lot of our mature stocks that really there's an abundance to be able to play in sit within that over 10 typically for us right now. But I wouldn't be surprised to see it drop closer to 8, go back up again. So it's really profile.
Yeah.
Closer to 8, go back up again. So it's really profile.
The only problem with blending with the 13 with the 8 is you has to be in one season. The only problem. So you can't she could come up with something that's like that and do it at 100 proof, but you'd have to keep it like the whole thing with bottle and bond. It has to be a season, a season.
Well, and honestly, although she hasn't said one way or the other, because that's the kind of thing that we want to focus on. This is no younger than 8,
right?
But it's very typically you're pushing upward just to get the match flavor profile you're looking for. So 1 year,
whatever it takes,
over that line. And so for this, it's
140, 110, whatever it takes.
It is one of those things where
220, 225, whatever.
I kind of like the example I use a lot when it comes to bottled and bond is kind of thinking of bottled and bond whiskeys the same way you think of, your favorite restaurant that runs on a seasonal menu or bar program. You know what I mean? The idea that you're sourcing seasonal ingredients.
Right.
And so the spring
Because you're going for whatever tastes better.
right. And then only what you have available to
Right.
you that you can actually use the resources you have to create this. So
100.
it's always going to be 100. That's the core to it. And again, that kind of roots back to that transparency idea for bottled and bonds, which is why I think that they're a great proxy for quality. That's a valid proxy when you're going into and you go upstairs and you're like, what bottled and bonds do you have currently? You know, you're looking for something that is very transparent because I mean, at the end of the day, the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897 was the first ever consumer protection law in the books by the United States government before the Pure Food and Drug Act, right? They were like, all right, let's start regulating what people are putting in their bodies so that they don't die. And we're going to try it on whiskey first.
Yeah. That's what the most important.
And they did that a lot. They tried out things on us
But
first.
you know, it's so funny because there's not a bond agent anymore. I mean, there's like, you know, everything is is regulated by a lot of other things. There's no bond agent in there doing that anymore. So it is but all the stipulations are still in effect.
They're all in effect. I mean, that's why, I mean, the most common misconception to say that is kind of shifted out of what the historic version was is to say produced under government supervision is part of it. But now, like, all spirits are regulated by government supervision. So that's kind of like, you know, that's just a wash at this point that's always going to happen. So we don't even have to call it out that there's a bonding agent there.
That's right.
As opposed to historically where you had someone
Signing off
with their own lock to these warehouses and only unlocking the ones that you submit in the morning to say, these are the warehouses we're going into, unlock those for us and then lock them back up when we're done.
Yeah. What do you guys think? Good? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What do you guys think? Are these all the same mash bill?
Yeah, mash bill for everything corn based coming out of our distillery is all the same, right? 84, 8, 8. So 84 corn, 8 rye, 8 malts. Which also I personally love. We have a lot of product right between the Tennessees, the bourbons, the bottled and bond, all the corn based stuff coming from Dickel with the same mash bill does really show versatility, right? And how much they can shift with such a high corn content.
I know this is at 100. Do you have a question? Yep. I know this is at 100. Do you have a question? Yep. I know this is at 100. Is there anything extra that goes into certifying other than saying
we do it?
Yeah, saying you do it. Yeah.
I mean, the first step is saying you do it, but you have to like basically the way that most of
there's a paper trail.
There's a paper trail. So there's a lot of regulations that are going in. We're submitting our production processes. There's audits that can happen to the distillery itself. There's, you know, the whole cola as far as like the actual, once you submit a label for what's going into that product, there's a paper trail then of them being able to verify everything that's happening, which is that produced under government supervision thing. But that's going to be happening for everything. Same here, right? Everything that's happening out of the distillery is going to be subject to audit, subject to its submission for all production practices. So,
I mean, you got to remember that Bottled and Bond was the one that the government watched. I mean, you got to remember, and you were almost free to do whatever the hell you wanted on the other stuff. Now the government watches all of it. So I mean, that sort of like that sort of requirement is really on everything you produce.
Yeah.
Where requirement is really on no, but you do it's not above and beyond anything else, but you have to meet the criteria of the rest of what would be considered bottled and bond.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So basically, and like all the inventory, everything that is now all automated, it's scanned in and everything else, like all of those tags are going to be registered with the government. So like they have the ability to go in pretty easily and kind of see what's happening at the distillery. It's you know, all this comes as this trickle down effect that once taxes started happening on this spirit, that's when the hands came in and they were like, all right, well then we got to make sure
that you're doing these things.
Right. Because we need to make sure we're getting the money we need.
Exactly.
And want from you.
When you can't understand something that's going on in the liquor industry or really in anything, the answer is taxes. just so we're all, and as we hit April 15th
next week. Could talk about
it, but it is. I mean, when you can't figure something out, why would they do it this way? It's taxes. I mean, most of the time, that's the answer.
Yeah.
I know that this is at 100 proof, and I'm not advocating you want to bring that down or anything, but even the Randall Bird method, take a nice drink of water, take a nice sip of this. You're gonna see a whole bunch of other flavors really pop on this. So it's the equivalently of adding like a drop of water to this. But I think you'll even see,
Oh yeah.
without adding water, the other just take a drink and then go at it that way. But there's a lot of flavor going on in here.
I think the fruit kicks up
The
pretty
fruit
high,
does kick up,
right?
definitely.
Which is kind of indicative of both, right? Like it gets some of those bourbon notes, but it's all this. There's a big juicy fruit quality that comes with a lot of
Yeah.
our barrels that really pops out.
Yeah, it really does. Did somebody else have a question?
Yeah, barrels that really
No.
pops out.
Yeah, it really does. Did somebody else have a question? Can you tell us who
yeah.
George Dickel was?
I love that. Yeah. So George was an actual person, right? So he came over to the United States in the mid 1850s. And honestly, just like a lot of like roots of folks that were starting in this industry anyway, he was a merchant first. So it was actually his connection to the Cascade Distillery, which was already running before he got to Nashville, that was operating and producing whiskey. But like so many other distilleries are the roots of these heritage brands. It all starts from somebody selling it under a name and finding whatever they could. And eventually, partnerships start to happen where it's like instead of a bunch of different people you're getting the whiskey from, you start to like tighten it up. And so eventually working with just the Cascade Distillery became something where it wasn't buying from, but buying into and becoming partners with, at the time was the Schwab family, right? Who was running and operating the Cascade Distillery. So, and then that's when he kind of was a part of it, running it with his partners, before falling off his horse and dying of complications in the right before the turn of the century. So, and Dickel is also, as a brand, is one of these brands because Prohibition came to Tennessee early. They were real aggressive with the whole temperance movement in Tennessee. So 1911 was when statewide prohibition was enacted in the state. And so the Dickel was one of the facilities that was operating that wasn't just shut down, but was torn down. So where we are now, our current location is about a mile away from our original site. The original site was much closer to the Cascade Spring, the water source. But if you see that area, like we're now in the holler, right? In that open space between all the mountains. But before they were up very close to and building on the side of two hills because it was closer to the water source, which at the time was more convenient than having to figure out a way to get the water from all the way over here to all the way over here. Now we're a little farther down the way, and we rebuilt in 1958, and it was the Shinley Corporation at the time that owned it, a man by the name of Ralph Dukes, who actually worked and operated out of the Stitzel-Weller distillery in Louisville. He's the one who pioneered, got this distillery rebuilt and opened in 1959. So, and it's been the same location. And pretty much a lot of the equipment is the same equipment from 1959 on. If you ever get the chance to come down and visit us,
It's a beautiful facility.
yeah, it's in Tullahoma, so that's about an hour and 15 minutes southeast of Nashville. You're spending about half your time on the highway and half your time on back roads going over Normandy Lake. It's a beautiful drive. You got a motorcycle, it's a great way to do it, and just kind of get out there nicely.
Yeah.
You got a motorcycle, it's a great way to do it.
Any other questions before we move on to our the next whiskey? Because this is really cool. The next one I think is I don't know if a lot of you familiar with the Leopold brothers. Yeah, Johnny is. Yeah. So this is a little bit of a collaboration. It's a rye whiskey.
This is, I mean, how much time do we got?
You get 10 minutes. No, yeah.
Okay. Because this is a really fun one to talk about.
Yeah.
And I mean, we're taking a departure first and foremost because we're leaving corn behind a little bit. We're moving over to rye. But this is a collaboration between the Leopold Brothers Distillery operating out of Denver, Colorado, family run and operated by Todd and Scott Leopold themselves, right? And they've been running it since 1999, collaborating with Nicole and the George Dickel brand. And so kind of the story goes, as Todd and Nicole tell it so often, is that Todd is one of these guys, although he won't talk about himself this way, but he's one of those guys that like at the end of the long day, he sits down with, his favorite pour of whiskey and reads like pre-prohibition era tax and survey papers on production practices of distilleries, that survey that was associated with the Taft decision, which was essentially the sitting president's way of surveying all of the operating distillers to figure out what everyone was doing to start classifying these things. And he came across this survey that referenced this thing called a three-chamber still. It's not a column still, it's not a pot still, it's something completely different. But it came out that a bunch of operating distilleries, specifically with rye whiskey, were running this still. He's like, what is this? He's like, I've been doing this for a long time, but I've never heard of this. Starts calling around. He's part of the Craft Spirits Association and everything else, asking people about it. Well, he eventually finds kind of a flow chart diagram in some other book or paper that actually shows what this thing looks like. He goes to Vendome and he gets them to build him a three-chamber still. So it's the only one in the world to date. Right. And it operates completely differently than really anything else. In fact, from my understanding, this is the only time so far that Vendome has not given a full guarantee on the still that they made, because there was no precedent for it. They're like, I don't know if it's going to work, but good luck. Let's see what happens. Luckily, Todd turned it on and it did. But it's anyone that's super into it and into the nerdy technical side of it. Leopold has put together this amazing like 27-minute YouTube video that shows all of it. Right? It's got a great like video to it. It shows the flow chart of exactly how this thing works. But at the end of the day, what's really interesting is that it's like 3 micro distillations almost, right? Where the mash is getting transferred from chamber to chamber to chamber with no new mash being added into it, but you're separating out alcohol in each one of these distillations. So by the time you get to the bottom chamber, the 3rd chamber, it's so hot and pressurized that you're getting upwards, right, of like, I think it's like, 200, 220, somewhere around there as far as temperature wise, 230. And you're getting to this point where there's almost 0% alcohol left in this mash. So now you're getting a distillation and separation of like essential oils, basically. It's like he calls it his rye flavor extractor, because that's what it's pulling out. So it creates this huge whiskey. In fact, like I've been there, I've sat there at the bar at Leopold Brothers with Todd. He's poured me his most recent release of the 3-chamber rye. Tasted. I'm like, man, that is so interesting. I can't believe it. Reeling over this whiskey, and he's like, "Do you want another one?" And I'm like, "No." It's like Todd will say, it's the kind of whiskey you want to sit down and contemplate death while drinking. It's big, it's bold, it's fascinating. It was always in his research, it was always intended to be blended with a lighter column distilled whiskey, because everyone that was running a 3-chamber historically was also running a column. And so they were referring to these things called heavy bodied whiskey and light bodied whiskey. And then it occurs, and that's where this project came from. He reached out to Nicole. He's like, this was meant to be blended with a lighter style of rye whiskey. So he reached out to Nicole, not because he thought that she had any rye really available. In fact, it's very common knowledge that the Dickel rye that's out there in the market is from MGP. We're very open with that. We charcoal filter it as well, but we don't make it at the distillery. She was like, I'll call you tomorrow. And she called the 17 people she probably had to call within Diageo to be able to even talk about what she was about to tell him. And she's like, hey, listen, since I've been here, we've been making rye whiskey, right? But we haven't used it for anything. So she's like, I've got some, let's do this. And that's where this comes from, right? To where they took a lighter bodied whiskey that is our column distilled rye, blended it together with this heavy bodied 3-chamber to come up with something that's palatable but interesting, and really like a recreation of a pre-prohibition era whiskey
style, right?
Exactly.
And, what always fascinated me about the 3 columns, the 3 column
3-chamber
chamber still,
Yeah.
was that they picked rye. Like rye is not exactly the easiest grain like work with, and anybody that I've ever talked to that's been in distillation, that's done rye and stuff like that, it's like you got to be real careful with rye. It can get away from you very, very quickly.
Yep.
Matter of fact, I'm looking over and I'm seeing the guys at Brooklady. They did a rye and it took them for like I forgot how many days to clean up.
Yeah.
after it was done because
they
it
call
just
it
went amok.
a dirty grain.
Yeah, and went amok. So I mean, to even start getting down to like 200 degrees and doing stuff like that, I just thinking in my head like all the things that could go wrong, and no wonder Vendome was like, hey, here you go.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, and to make it even nerdier, because that's how Todd operates, he also is using a heritage grain of a strain of rye
Right.
that he got from Italy called a Bruzzi rye, because he didn't want to use the rye that was really available in the US because the beverage alcohol industry has kind of driven up some of the starch contents over time, right, to allow for more starch available, right, for more sugar, for the higher conversion. So the Abruzzi rye that he brought back from Italy, and like handful of seeds essentially. And because of his relationship with the Coors farmers in Colorado, because they also have their own malting facility and everything else, he was able to, with these great farmers, to be able to grow. And now he's got fields of this Abruzzi rye that he has. And it's like the starch content's like 60 something percent, like low 60s, which most rye that people are operating is pushing up to 80. So the fact that it's much lower starch is also, I think,
Maybe that's part of the reason they can do that.
well, but it's also means that there's a reason why this stopped doing this, right? The three chamber it's wildly inefficient, and now you're reducing your starch even more. So the amount of actual conversion that you're getting is so low. I mean, Todd, like there's a reason they stopped making these or using these stills in the United States is because eventually efficiency became king in manufacturing in the US. And the same amount of copper that he uses for this column still would make 200 barrels a day. Right? Single days operations, 200 barrels. This still makes two. That's it. So I mean, you don't need that much in a project like this, but it is really like it's inefficient. It's not really going to be a moneymaker when it comes to selling whiskey, but it is going to make something amazing and unique and interesting. And so try it if you haven't already, for sure.
The flavor, it's still concentrated.
Mhm.
The flavor, it's still concentrated. It's still concentrated. Yeah, come over here. I'll slap you. No, there is. I will agree with it's. I don't know if it's similar to the Mortlock that I like of the Flora Fauna series, but there is a definite apple flavor. And if you are tasting that in the Mortlock, then you're tasting it. I would never argue with somebody that's what you're tasting. I believe there is an apple note in this. To me, it almost borderlines. If I was going to draw it to something, as you ever had Barons and apple schnapps? If I was going to draw it to something, we sell it upstairs. It's not like it's that flavor though. That flavor of apple that I get off.
Well, and this is the other beauty. There's so many things I can say are my favorite thing about this whiskey.
Really good.
One of them is that this does open our perspective collectively. Like, what do we all talk when we talk about rye whiskey? Our range of usually what we're describing it to be is like this big. That's what we're talking. We're talking about spice. We're talking about clove.
Right.
Like these things are what dominate our opinions of rye whiskey. And this is something that shows that I think it was bigger and it had a larger range historically, like we expect bourbon to have, right? A big range of bookends as far as how far this flavor profile can be. This is showing that rye has more dynamic qualities to it than we're used to. And this is how rye whiskey tasted. I mean, we were lucky enough to be able to have Dave Wondrich and Noah Rothbaum come down to when we launched this and taste it, and Dave's one of those guys that actually like has pre-prohibition era bottles of rye whiskey, and to be able to be like, you don't really ever know if these old bottles are that you're tasting now, if
how much they've changed. What have they done? If they changed,
right?
But now if you're trying this to that, you go, oh, wait a minute, there's a similarity.
There's a similarity there, which means like, yes, there is, like what we're tasting in these old bottles is tracking. And it's kind of a great experiment to understand how it stands up and what that category really is and really what it was. And that's, this is showing a lot of that.
I always find that funny because we've pigeonholed rye to be a certain thing, and the other we pigeonhole rye to be a certain thing. It matures, I think, matures quicker than corn mash bills, right? You can do 2 to 4 year rise are mature,
Yeah.
right? So there's a difference that way. We've been in a long time getting to a point where the line, I think it's finally starting to go back, but the line between what was considered bourbon and what was considered rye was really close together because it was like jumping around that 51 range. Like, it was a 60% corn, and then all of a sudden it'd be like a 60% rye. I mean, and the other mash bills would be the other parts of the mash bill were the same. So they were getting very like all of a sudden they were starting to get similar. But when you start tasting things like this, and you start tasting like Old Pachero, which is 100% malted rye, and you're getting some of the people are now doing, well, you just got a malted rye this week. You just ordered two. You get like, New Riff doing malted rye, and you get the stuff from even from Ireland who are doing malted and unmalted, and you get these mash bills that are like not typical, but especially in rye, malted, unmalted, this chamber that these three chambers they're doing, all of a sudden you realize rye has a lot more going on than, a flavor ingredient for bourbon or, almost a straight rye for the rest of us, but unmalted.
Right. 100%. I mean, I think, there was a time where either, yes, you were really close to bourbon, which maybe was necessary for a while because like you had to bring us along,
Right.
right? You slowly train your palate up. Or the other side of the coin was always like, it was off-putting, right? Like you could ask any room and you'd be like, how many people like rye? I mean, maybe not in this room because y'all probably drink a lot of whiskey, but like there's still a lot of people that don't like rye whiskey because they've had one particular instance of what it was, and it's like too aggressive. They're like, I don't like drinking a punch in the face.
Spruce, pickle,
Right.
You get into those type of flavor characteristics.
So often there's like the common misconception with scotch where they only associate one track of flavor profile, or gin for that matter. You know what I mean? It's like I got one impression and it was, it's make or break, when really you have to understand that there's such a range, and rye has such a huge range too. Yeah.
What do you guys think of this?
Yeah.
Very interesting, right? Really, really cool. All right.
So you got one more coming. The other thing I would say that I have to still mention because I think it's so cool is that besides the liquid itself, right? This bottle in particular. I mean, if you look at this label, I have yet to ever see really in the whiskey world where we're seeing direct competitors with equal billing on the front of this bottle, right? We don't own any part of Leopold Brothers. In fact, one of Todd's favorite parts about working with Diageo as a company was the fact that he says no one ever tried to buy it. Not once did that conversation come up. And like we've got a whole channel ready and locked and loaded in order to invest in small distilleries and craft distilleries and things like that across the globe. But he said, they understood that it was important to him to stay family owned and operated so that his daughter could one day run a distillery if she wanted to. And that's huge. And on the other side of it, Nicole will say, hands down, and besides this whiskey itself, her favorite part about doing this project was the contract structure that was negotiated between the largest spirit company in the world and an independently owned and operated distillery to set precedent for this to potentially happen for other craft distillers in the future. Because now it's been done, right? There is a legal channel to be able to do this kind of collaboration out in the world.
Kavork? Right. Kavork. This kind of collaboration. Could you just give us two so we can start talking about it? Right. And now, like, that's the hard part is actually how do we do this?
Yeah.
And that's the more difficult part. That's the hard part. I just wanted to make sure that we got up here and then continue with everybody else.
Thank you.
Just in case. Thank you, sir. Continue with everybody else. Thank you.
Yeah.
And like again, you're making this, you're making this thought of something to happen. That you're making, in all right should.
Right. I mean, we spend so much time, I'm a brand ambassador, right? For a specific company, right? And how much do we all end up seeing the amount of time that's had about, you know, fighting for space and doing this and doing that. And like, when at the end of the day, when you talk to any actual distiller, right, behind the scenes, right, they're like, oh yeah, you know what I mean? Like, I called them up because I was thinking about doing a new project.
Yeah, they figure out how to do that.
Yeah,
You
and
know,
they call their friend who works somewhere else. And so like, this also is like a nice representation that in the actual production world of American whiskey, it's still relatively small.
That's
And
right.
you know, like Todd called Nicole because like they were both a part of, you know, Nicole was the founding board, one of the founding board members of the American Craft Spirits Association.
Right.
She was the founding president of the New York State Distillers Guild and was a part of like getting Empire Rye to be brought back as a category.
Right.
You know, so she's all about that world. And so this is kind of highlighting that, like that kind of like, you know, gets you in the feels a little bit, I think. But
Yeah.
it's a cool concept.
I definitely think so. I think it's really cool.
Yeah.
All right. First of all, I want to thank Kevork for the next taste that we got going on here.
Yeah.
And thank you, Kevork. At its heart, this is still a whiskey club. So this is how we sort of started about sharing stuff. What you guys have now is George Dickel, 15-year-old. This is at 50.4% ABV. And that'll give you let you tell everything else out about it. But
yeah,
we finished Kevork's bottle of this. So thank you, sir.
Yeah. So this is coming, it's single barrel, right?
Yeah.
So this is coming from our single barrel, or the, you know, single barrel program. And you know, that's the beauty of single barrels anyway. Yeah, I'm sure everyone here is quite familiar. But the thing I love the most about it is honestly the volatility of single barrels, right? The fact that you don't know what you're getting in a lot of ways. And it shows potentially the diversity of coming into it. Now with Dickel, you know, like I said before, we have the one mash bill. Everything is made and put down, and then we're just tracking. It's like, it's going to grow, see what it grows up to become, you know? It's like, you can make this thing and you can create an environment for it, but then you just have to sit and let it happen. You know, it's like having kids kind of. But I do think that it's, for this one in particular, without even trying it yet, the thing about Dickel that I love is that, so our maturation practices and our barrel entry proof kind of allow us to get to this point a little bit. So our barrel entry is 115 as opposed to 125, which is, we find, is a pretty industry standard. Plus our warehouses are just 6 barrels high, so single story warehouses, as for all of this. So all of that, I think, ventures, for one, we get a slower maturation process as far as the amount of, like, the effect of the oak on the whiskey itself, and two, we get a higher rate of spirit evaporation to water on a regular basis. So at 115, we'll consistently find 15-year-old barrels that are down to 80. You know, we drop in proof over time, which sometimes can be a thing we talked about earlier, where it's like people are asking for higher. But I'd say we're pulling a lot more oak components. Like, we're not getting astringency from the high proof from a single barrel, but we may get more tannic astringency from the oak.
Wood influence
on it in a different way, right? So it's that soft curve that's happening as it drops in proof, but still gives us, you know, a nice range. So
what do you guys think? Like it?
Nice range.
Pickle a Dickel? Like it?
So the other fun game I like to play when it comes to single barrels in general is, now that we have like what I consider to be like 2 tracks at the distillery, our Tennessee whiskey track and our bourbon track. Now I taste these single barrel samples and things like that. And the first thing that goes to my mind is like, all right, if we didn't isolate this for this program, which one will we use it for? Will we use it for bourbon? Will we use it for Tennessee whiskey? Will we use it for bottled and bond? Like, because they are pretty distinctly different. Like, to me, this whiskey in particular, I don't know what you guys see, but pretty distinctly different. Like, to me, this whiskey in particular, I get some of the bigger fruit notes that came out of the bottled and bond.
Bottle and bond.
Yeah, very much. I mean, this is a really good barrel. It definitely it ventures really close to this in a lot of like singular characteristics.
And it's not that far off on the proof either. So I'm talking like a point.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I want to thank you very much for doing this for us. This is really, really appreciated.
Yeah. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. All right, we're gonna take off. You should have been here. This was really cool. But we're gonna sign off from Facebook now. Thanks everybody for joining us.